Hello and welcome to Classroom Nation. Today's topic is the Wars of the Roses, and for a more simplified and shorter version, please follow a link in the description. The Wars of the Roses were a series of battles fought between the two royal houses of York and Lancaster for control of the English throne. The Wars of the Roses were very long, bloody, and full of intrigue. The origins of the conflict can go back as far as the 9th century and King Alfred. Prior to King Alfred, any member of the royal family could claim the English throne, no matter how distant. But Alfred installed a new set of rules stating only the sons and brothers of the king could claim. William the Conqueror ended the line of Anglo-Saxon kings in 1066 and left the throne to his son. However, William the Conqueror's son, Henry I, died in 1135, leaving no surviving heir. England then entered a period of time known as the Anarchy. However, following the ascension of Henry II in 1154, the crown passed father to son and brother to brother with little difficulty until 1399. The problems really started to arise after the death of Edward III in 1377. This is considered one of the main causes of the Wars of the Roses. Edward's succession was all but guaranteed with 5 sons. However, towards the end of his reign, his eldest son Edward Woodstock, also known as the Black Prince, died. This left Edward III with 4 surviving legitimate sons: Lionel, Duke of Clarence, also called Lionel of Antwerp; John, Duke of Lancaster, also known as John of Gaunt; Edmund, Duke of York, also called Edmund Langley; and Thomas, Duke of Gloucester. However, Edward was succeeded to the throne by the Black Prince's only surviving son, Richard II, who was only 10 years old at the time. Richard's claim to the throne was based on the principle that the son of the elder brother had priority in succession over his uncles. Since Richard was a child and there was no direct heir, there was great uncertainty about who would succeed him next. If Richard died without legitimate offspring, his successor by primogeniture would have been the descendants of Lionel of Antwerp, Edward's second son. Lionel's daughter Philippa married into the Mortimer family and had one son called Roger Mortimer, who technically had the best claim. However, a legal decree issued by Edward III in 1376 introduces some complexity. He limited the right of succession only to male heirs, which placed the third son of John of Gaunt ahead of Lionel, Duke of Clarence's descendants, because the Mortimer line of descendants passes through a daughter. Richard became increasingly unpopular with the nobles, and throughout his reign, Richard had repeatedly switched choices of heir to keep his political enemies at bay. Nevertheless, when Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, returned from exile in 1399, initially to reclaim his rights as Duke of Lancaster, he took advantage of the support from most of the nobles to depose Richard and was crowned King Henry IV, establishing the House of Lancaster on the throne. Henry's claim to the throne was through his father, John of Gaunt. At the beginning of Richard II's reign, John of Gaunt was the official heir, but due to all the court intrigue, the succession was unclear by the time Henry took power. Therefore, an argument could be made that Edward Mortimer, the son of Roger Mortimer, was the legitimate king. Many people believed this to be the case, but there was little support at the time for a counterclaim. As Henry's initial support waned, the Mortimer family's claim grew stronger, and it was the cause of the Owen Glendower rebellion in Wales, and there were other less successful revolts in Cheshire and Northumberland. There were uprisings in support of the Mortimers throughout Henry IV's reign, which lasted until 1413. Henry IV's son and successor, Henry V, inherited a fairly pacified nation, and his military success against France in the 100 Years' War only bolstered his popularity, enabling him to strengthen the Lancastrian hold on the throne. Nevertheless, there was one notable conspiracy against Henry, the Southampton Plot. This was led by Richard, Earl of Cambridge, who attempted to place Edmund Mortimer, his brother-in-law, on the throne. Cambridge was executed in 1415. This is important because it brings Richard, Duke of York, into play. Richard was the son of Cambridge and Anne Mortimer, and he was 4 years old at the time of his father's execution. Although the title of Cambridge was taken away from him by Henry V, Henry later allowed Richard to inherit the title and lands of Cambridge's elder brother, Edward, when he died in 1425, thus making Richard the new Duke of York, and it gave him a strong claim to the throne through Anne Mortimer. Henry V's premature death in 1422, at the age of 36, led to his only son, Henry VI, coming to the throne. Henry was just a boy, and the country was being ruled by a divided council. Henry V's younger brothers also produced no surviving legitimate heirs, thus leaving only distant cousins as alternative Lancaster heirs. As Richard, Duke of York, grew into maturity and questions were raised over Henry VI's fitness to rule, Richard's claim to the throne grew stronger and stronger. The revenue from York and March estates also made Richard, Duke of York, one of the richest men in the land. From early childhood, Henry was surrounded by quarrelsome counsellors and advisors. Henry VI's coming of age in 1437 did not end the nobleman's scheming, as his weak personality made him easily influenced by others, especially those he deemed his favourites. The Beauforts and Suffolks were dominant personalities at court. They contributed to the mismanagement of the government and the poor execution of the 100 Years' War. This meant that under Henry VI all the land in France was lost that Henry V had previously won. This included the provinces of Guienne and Gascony, which had been held for over 300 years. However, there was opposition to the Suffolks and Beauforts, and this was led by Humphrey Gloucester and Richard, Duke of York. The Duke of York was described as a skeptic of peace and became enraged by the Suffolk and Beauforts frequently receiving large grants of money and land from the king, as well as important government and military positions. This redirected much-needed resources away from York's campaign in France. Eventually, Richard, Duke of York, was stripped of his prestigious military command in France and was sent to govern Ireland, whereby he could not interfere in the proceedings of court. In all of these quarrels, Henry VI took little part. He was seen as a weak and ineffectual king. He also displayed signs of severe mental illness that he may have inherited from his maternal grandfather, Charles VI of France. By 1450, many considered Henry incapable of carrying out the duties and responsibilities of being a king. In 1450, there was a revolt in Kent, the Jack Cades Rebellion, which is often seen as the prelude to the Wars of the Roses. The rebels' manifesto, The Complaint of the Poor of the Commons of Kent, was written under Cade's leadership. It accused the Crown of extortion, perversion of justice, and election fraud. The rebels occupied parts of London, and they even executed the Lord High Treasurer. After some of them fell to looting, and the others driven out of London by citizens, they dispersed after they were supposedly pardoned, but several, including Cade, were later executed. After the rebellion, the rebels' grievances formed the basis of Richard of York's opposition to the royal government, from which he now felt excluded. In 1450, Richard of York returned to England from his post in Ireland and went to London demanding the king removes Lord Somerset, but he was unsuccessful. 2 years later, in 1452, York called an army to him and marched on London demanding Somerset's removal and reform of the government. At this stage, few nobles supported such drastic actions, and York was forced to submit to superior force at Blackheath. He was imprisoned until 1453, but was released after swearing never to take arms against the crown again. In 1453, conditions were ripe for civil war. There was increasing disharmony at court and the country as a whole. Noble families engaged in private feuds and showed increasing disrespect for royal authority. In many cases, the feuds were fought between old established families and formerly minor nobility raised to power under the influence of King Henry IV in the aftermath of the rebellions against him. The king was also so easily manipulated, it meant that power rested with those closest to him at court. In other words, Somerset and the Lancastrian faction. Richard and the Yorkist faction found their power slowly slipping away. Henry was persuaded to grant many royal lands and estates to the Lancastrians, thereby losing his revenue and further enraging the Yorkists. In 1453, Henry also suffered a severe bout of complete mental collapse, during which he failed to recognise even his newborn son Edward. And on the 22nd of March, 1454, Cardinal John Kemp, his Chancellor, died. Henry was incapable of nominating his successor. His queen, Margaret Anjou, attempted to establish herself as regent, but found no success, since the Lords did not like the idea of a woman yielding power. To ensure the country could still be governed, a council of regents was set up. Headed by Duke of York, who remained popular with the people as the Lord Protector, York soon asserted his power with ever greater boldness. He imprisoned Somerset and backed the Neville allies in their counter-feud with the Earl of Northumbria, a powerful supporter of Henry. Henry recovered in 1455 and once again fell under the influence of those closest to him at court. Directed by Somerset, Richard was forced out of court. Somerset began to conspire with other nobles to reduce York's influence, summoning a parliament that York feared meant to name him a traitor, and increasingly thwarted Richard finally resorted to armed hostilities. Richard, Duke of York, led a small force towards London, and he was met by Henry's force at St Albans, just north of London, on the 22nd of May, 1455. The relatively small First Battle of St. Albans was the first conflict of the Civil War. Richard's aim was supposedly to remove poor advisors from Henry's side. The result was a Lancastrian defeat. Several prominent Lancastrian leaders were killed, including Somerset and Northumberland. After the battle, the Yorkists found Henry hiding in a local tanner's shop, abandoned by his advisors and servants, apparently having suffered another bout of mental illness. York and his allies regained their positions of influence, and with the king indisposed with mental illness, York was protector of the realm once more. Margaret was pushed aside and charged with the king's care once more. For a while, both sides seemed shocked that an actual battle had taken place, and they did their best to reconcile their differences. But the problems soon arose once more, particularly the issue of whether the Duke of York or Henry, Margaret's infant son, should succeed the throne. Margaret refused to accept any solution that would disinherit her son, and it became clear that she would only tolerate York and his allies whilst they had the military power. Henry recovered, and in February 1456 he relieved York of his office of the Protector. In the autumn that year, Henry went on a royal progress in the Midlands, where the king and queen were very popular. Margaret did not allow him to return to London, where the merchants were very angry at the decline in the trade and widespread disorder. The king's court was set up in Coventry. By then the new Duke of Somerset was emerging as his favourite. Margaret persuaded Henry to revoke the appointments York had made as protector, replacing them with men she believed to be loyal to the king and queen and their son, whilst York was made to return to his post in Ireland. There was also widespread disorder in the capital, the north of England, and piracy in the English Channel. But the king and queen remained intent on protecting their positions, and they stayed in Coventry. Meanwhile, York's ally Warwick was growing in popularity in London. As a champion of the merchants and a captain of Calais, he fought off piracy in the English Channel. The next outbreak of fighting was prompted by Warwick's heavy-handed action as captain of Calais. He led ships in an attack on the neutral Hassanic League and the Spanish ships in the Channel, on a flimsy ground of sovereignty. He was summoned to London to face an inquiry, but he claimed an attempt was made on his life and returned to Calais. York, Salisbury and Warwick were summoned to the royal court in Coventry, but they refused, fearing arrests once they arrived. York summoned the Nevilles to join him at his stronghold in Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marshes. On the 23rd of September 1459, the Battle of Blore Heath in Staffordshire took place. A Lancastrian army failed to prevent Salisbury from marching from the Middleham Castle in Yorkshire to Ludlow. Shortly afterwards, the combined Yorkist army confronted a much larger Lancastrian force at the Battle of Ludlow Bridge. Warwick's contingent from the garrison of Calais under Andrew Trollope defected to the Lancastrian side, and the Yorkist leaders fled. York returned to Ireland, and his eldest son Edward, Salisbury and Warwick fled to Calais. The Lancastrians were back in total control. York and his supporters were attainted at Parliament as devils and traitors. Somerset was appointed governor of Calais and dispatched to take over the fortress on the French coast, but his attempts were easily repulsed by Warwick. Warwick and his supporters then began to raid the English coast to create further chaos. After being dishonoured in such a way, the Yorkists could only recover their lands and titles by a successful invasion. Warwick travelled to Ireland to meet with Richard of York to plan their invasion. In late June 1460, Warwick, Salisbury and Edward crossed the English Channel and rapidly established themselves in Kent and London, where they enjoyed the widespread support. Backed by a papal embassy who had taken their side, they marched north. King Henry led an army south to meet them, while Margaret remained north with Prince Edward. At the Battle of Northampton on the 10th of July, the Yorkist army under Warwick defeated the Lancastrians, aided by treachery in the king's ranks, and for a second time in the war, King Henry was found by the Yorkists in a tent, abandoned by his retinue, having suffered another mental breakdown. With the king in their possession, the Yorkists returned to London, where they were able to claim that their dishonourment was unlawful because the king was forced to agree to it. In the light of this military success, Richard moved to press his claim to the English throne. Based on the illegitimacy of the Lancastrian line, landing in the north of Wales, he and his wife Cecilia entered London with all the ceremony usually reserved for a monarch. The Parliament was assembled. When York entered, he made straight for the throne. He may have been expecting for the Lords to greet him with rapturous applause, similar to that of Henry IV when he took the throne in 1399. Instead, he was met by stunned silence, and even his most loyal supporters of Warwick and Salisbury were shocked. At this stage, they had no desire to overthrow the king. Their ambition was still limited to the removal of councillors. However, the next day, York produced a detailed genealogy to support his claim. His claim was based on his descent from Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence. York's claim was through the daughter of a second son. Henry's was through the son of a third son. The judges felt that common law principles could not determine who had priority in royal succession. They declared the matter above the law and passed their learning. Parliament then agreed to consider the matter. They accepted York's claim was better, but by a majority of 5, they voted King Henry VI should remain king. A compromise was struck on October 1460 with the Act of Accord. This recognised York as Henry's successor, disinheriting Henry's 6-year-old son, Edward. York accepted this compromise as a best offer. It gave him much of what he wanted, particularly since he was then made protector of the realm once more. Queen Margaret and her son fled northwards to Scotland to negotiate a Scottish assistance. Mary, Queen Consort to James II of Scotland, agreed to give Margaret an army on condition that she gives up the town of Berwick to Scotland, and Mary's daughter be betrothed to Prince Edward. Margaret agreed, although she had no funds to pay the army and could only promise booty and riches from southern England, as long as no looting took place north of the River Trent. Margaret quickly sent letters to all of her fervent Lancastrian supporters, and she marched south. She claimed that the Act of Accord was unlawful since Henry agreed to it under duress. The Duke of York left London later that year with the Earl of Salisbury to consolidate his position in the north against the Lancastrians, who were amassing an army near the city of York. He took up a defensive position at Sandal Castle near Wakefield. Then, on December 30th, 1460, he left the castle and attacked the Lancastrians in the open, despite being outnumbered. The ensuing Battle of Wakefield was a complete Lancastrian victory. Richard of York was slain in battle, and both Salisbury and York's 17-year-old second son, Edmund, were captured and executed. The Act of Accord and the events of Wakefield left the 18-year-old Edward, Earl of March, York's eldest son, as the new Duke of York, and heir to his claim on the throne. With a pro-Yorkist army, he met Jasper Tudor's Lancastrian army arriving from Wales, and he defeated them soundly at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross in Herefordshire. Meanwhile, Margaret's army was moving south, supporting itself by looting as it passed through the prosperous southern England. In London, Warwick used this as propaganda to reinforce the Yorkist support throughout the south. The town of Coventry switched allegiances to the Yorkists. Warwick's army then established itself north of London in the town of St Albans. However, Margaret's army outmaneuvered him and moved to the west and then attacked from the south. In the Second Battle of St Albans, the Lancastrians won another victory. As the Yorkist forces fled, they left behind King Henry, who was found unharmed sitting quietly beneath a tree. As the Lancastrian army advanced southwards, a wave of dread swept over London, where there were wild rumours of savage northerners intent on plundering the city. The people of London shut the gates and refused to supply food to the Queen's army. Upon seeing the city's defiance to the Lancastrian cause, Queen Margaret and Jo ordered a retreat. Edward and Warwick joined forces and advanced westward towards London. Meanwhile, the Queen was retreating northwards towards Dunstable. As a result, Edward and Warwick were able to enter London with their army. They found great support there, since the city was largely Yorkist. It was clear that Edward no longer just wanted to replace councillors, but declare himself king. So Thomas Kemp, Bishop of London, asked the people of London their opinion, and they replied with shouts of "King Edward!" The request was quickly approved by Parliament, and Edward was unofficially appointed king in an impromptu ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Edward vowed he would not have a formal coronation until Henry VI and his wife were removed from the scene. Edward claimed Henry had forfeited the right to the crown by allowing his queen to take up arms against the rightful heirs under the Act of Accord. Edward and Warwick marched north, gathering a large army as they went. They then met an equally impressive Lancastrian army at Towton. The Battle of Towton near York was the biggest battle of the Wars of the Roses. Both sides agreed beforehand that the issue would be settled that day, with no quarter asked or given. An estimated 40,000 to 80,000 men took part in the battle, with over 20,000 men being killed, which is an enormous number for the time and the greatest single day's loss of life on English soil. Edward and his army won a decisive victory over the Lancastrians. With most of their leaders slain, Henry and Margaret, who were waiting for the result in York with their son Edward, fled north when they heard the news. Many of the surviving Lancastrian nobles switched allegiances to the new King Edward, and those who did not were driven back to the northern borders and to a few strongholds in Wales. The official coronation of Edward IV took place on June 1461 in London, where he received a rapturous welcome by his supporters. After the Battle of Towton, Henry VI and Margaret fled to Scotland, where they stayed in the court of James III, and followed through with their promise to cede Berwick to Scotland. Later in that year they mounted an attack on Carlisle, but lacking money they were easily repulsed by Edward's men. In 1465, the deposed King Henry was later captured for a third time at Clitheroe in Lancashire. He was taken to London and held prisoner in the Tower of London, where he was kept for a time and reasonably well treated. Around the same time, England and Scotland came to terms, and this forced Margaret and her son to leave Scotland and sail for France. This is where they stayed for several years in exile. The powerful Earl of Warwick, also known as the Kingmaker, had meanwhile become one of the greatest landowners in the country. Already a great landowner in his own right, he then inherited his father's estates and was granted much of the forfeited Lancastrian property. He also held many offices of state. He was convinced that England needed to form a new alliance with France and began negotiating a match between Edward and a French bride. However, Edward went behind his back and married Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of a former Lancastrian knight. In 1464, he announced the news of his new marriage, and this caused considerable embarrassment for Warwick. This embarrassment turned to bitterness when the Woodvilles came to be favoured in court over the Nevilles. Many of the Queen's relatives were married into noble families, and others were given great peerages and royal offices. There were also other factors which compounded Warwick's disillusionment. Edward preferred an alliance with Burgundy rather than France. He was also reluctant to allow his brother George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, to marry Warwick's daughters, Isabel and Anne. Furthermore, Edward's general popularity was on the wane in this period, due to high taxes and persistent disruptions of law. By 1469, Warwick decided to join forces with Edward's jealous and treacherous brother George, who married Elizabeth Neville in defiance of Edward's wishes. They raised an army and defeated the king's forces at the Battle of Edgecote Moor. Edward was captured at Olney in Buckinghamshire and imprisoned in Middleham Castle in Yorkshire. Warwick now had 2 kings of England in his custody, and he held all the cards. Warwick then had the Queen's father, Richard Woodville, and her brother, John Woodville, executed. However, he made no immediate move to have Edward declared illegitimate and placed George on the throne. The country was in turmoil, and the nobles once again settled scores with private armies, and the Lancastrians were being encouraged to rebel. Few nobles were prepared to support Warwick in his seizure of power. Edward was then later escorted to London by Warwick's brother George Neville, the Archbishop of York, where he and Warwick were reconciled to outward appearances. When further rebellions broke out in Lincolnshire, Edward could easily suppress them at the Battle of Losecoat Field. From the testimony of captured soldiers, he declared Warwick and George, Duke of Clarence, to have instigated them. They were declared traitors and forced to flee to France, where Margaret Anjou was already in exile. Louis XI of France then suggested an idea of an alliance between Warwick and Margaret. Neither of the two former mortal enemies entertained the idea at first, but eventually they came around to the idea after seeing the potential benefits. However, undoubtedly hoping for different outcomes, Warwick probably hoped for a puppet king in the form of Henry VI or his son Edward, whilst Margaret hoped to reclaim her family's realm once more. A marriage was arranged between Warwick's daughter Anne and Margaret's son Edward of Westminster, and Warwick then went on to invade England in the autumn of 1470. Whilst Edward IV marched north to suppress yet another Yorkshire uprising, Warwick landed in Dartmouth and quickly secured support from the southern counties and ports. He managed to occupy London by October, and paraded Henry VI through the streets as the restored king once more. Warwick's brother John Neville, who was leading an army in the Scottish marshes, suddenly defected to join Warwick. Edward was not prepared for this event, and he ordered his army to scatter. He and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, fled from Doncaster to Holland and exiled in Burgundy. They were proclaimed traitors, and many of the exiled Lancastrians returned to reclaim their estates. Warwick's success was short-lived, however. He overreached himself with a plan to invade Burgundy in alliance with the French king. He was tempted by King Louis's promise of territory in the Netherlands as a reward. This led Edward's brother-in-law Charles of Burgundy to provide funds and troops for Edward in helping him support an invasion into England. In 1471, Edward landed with a small force at Ravenspur in Yorkshire, initially claiming to support Henry and only seeking to restore his title of Duke of York. He soon gained the city of York and rallied several supporters. His brother George turned traitor again, abandoning Warwick. Having outmaneuvered Warwick, Edward then went on to capture London. His army then met Warwick's at the Battle of Barnet. The battle was fought in thick fog, and some of Warwick's men attacked each other by mistake. Warwick lost the battle and attempted to flee, but was cut down trying to reach his horse. Meanwhile, Margaret and her son Edward landed in the West Country on the same day. Rather than returning to France, Margaret sought to join forces with the Lancastrian supporters in Wales. But as she attempted to cross the River Severn, she was stopped by the city of Gloucester, who refused her passage. Her army was then destroyed at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Her son Edward, the Lancastrian heir, was killed, and Margaret Anjou was captured and brought to Edward in Coventry. Edward then returned triumphantly to London on May the 24th with Margaret Anjou by his side. With no heirs to succeed him, Henry VI was murdered shortly afterwards, on May the 21st, 1471. Eventually, Margaret was ransomed back to France in 1475, where she lived out the remainder of her days until 1482. The restoration of Edward IV in 1471 is sometimes seen as the end of the Wars of the Roses. Peace was restored once more to England, and his younger brother, Richard the Duke of Gloucester, and Edward's lifelong companion and supporter William Hastings were generously rewarded for their loyalty, becoming effectively governors of the North and Midlands respectively. His other brother, George Clarence, became increasingly estranged from Edward, and was eventually executed in 1478 for associating with convicted traitors. When Edward died suddenly in 1483, the political and dynastic turmoil erupted again. Many of the nobles still resented the influence of the Queen's Woodville relatives, and regarded them as power-hungry upstarts. At the time of Edward's premature death, his heir was Edward V. However, he was only 12 years old at the time, and had been brought up under the stewardship of the Earl of Rivers at Ludlow Castle. On his deathbed, Edward named his surviving brother, Richard of Gloucester, as protector of the realm. Richard had been in the north of England at the time of Edward's death, and Hastings sent word to him to bring a strong force to London to counter any forces that the Woodvilles might muster. The Duke of Buckingham also declared his support for Richard. Richard and Buckingham overtook Earl Rivers, who was escorting the young Edward V to London. At Stony Stratford in Buckinghamshire on the 29th of April, although Richard and Buckingham dined with Rivers in a friendly nature, the next day they took him prisoner and declared to Edward that they had done so to forestall a conspiracy by the Woodvilles against his life. Rivers and his nephew, Richard Grey, were sent to Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire and were executed. Edward entered London in the custody of Richard on the 4th of May, and was lodged in the Tower of London. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Woodville had already gone hastily into the sanctuary at Westminster with her remaining children. Although preparations were being made for Edward V to be crowned on the 22nd of June, at which Richard's authority as protector would end, on the 13th of June, Richard held a full meeting with the council, at which he accused Hastings and others of conspiring against him. Hastings was executed without trial that day. The Archbishop of Canterbury then persuaded Elizabeth Woodville to allow her younger son, the 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York, to join Edward in the Tower. Having secured both boys, the Bishop of Bath and Wells then alleged that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been illegal, and the two boys were therefore illegitimate. Richard then claimed the crown as King Richard III. The two imprisoned boys, known as the Princes in the Tower, disappeared and are assumed murdered. There was no trial or inquest into the matter. Having been crowned in a lavish ceremony on the 6th of July, Richard then proceeded on a tour around England, where he dispensed generous bounties and charters, naming his son the Prince of Wales. Opposition to Richard's rule had already begun in the south, when on the 18th of October the Duke of Buckingham, who had been instrumental in placing Richard on the throne in the first place, led a revolt against him. His aim was to install the Lancastrian Henry Tudor on the throne. The fact that he supported Henry Tudor over Edward V or his younger brother shows that he was probably aware that the two young boys had been murdered. The Lancastrian claim to the throne had descended to Henry Tudor upon the death of Henry VI and his son in 1471. Henry's father, Edmund Tudor, the first Earl of Richmond, had been the half-brother of Henry VI. But Henry's claim to royalty was through that of his mother, Margaret Beaufort. She was descended from John Beaufort, who was the son of John and Gort, thus the grandson of Edward III. John Beaufort had been illegitimate at birth, though later legitimised through marriage of his parents. Buckingham's rebellion failed. Some of the supporters in the south rose up prematurely, thus allowing Richard's men to prevent the rebels from joining forces. Buckingham himself raised a force at Brecon in mid-Wales. He was prevented from crossing the River Severn to join the rebels in the south of England because there were storms and floods. These storms and floods also prevented Henry Tudor from landing in the West Country. Buckingham's starving forces deserted him, and he was betrayed and eventually executed. The failure of Buckingham's revolt was clearly not the end of plots against Richard, who could never feel safe again. He then suffered the loss of his wife and 11-year-old son, putting the future of the Yorkist dynasty in doubt. Many of Buckingham's defeated supporters and other disaffected nobles fled to join Henry Tudor in exile. Richard made an attempt to bribe the Duke of Brittany to betray Henry, but Henry was warned and escaped to France, where he was again given sanctuary and aid. Confident that many nobles would join his cause, Henry set sail from France on the 1st of August 1485. He had a force of exiles and French mercenaries, and with fair winds he reached Pembrokeshire in 6 days. Henry gathered supporters as he marched through Wales, and then went on to meet Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard was slain during this battle, supposedly by a major Welsh landowner, Rhys ap Thomas, with a blow to the head from his poleaxe. Henry was acclaimed King Henry VII. He strengthened his position by marrying Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, and the second best surviving Yorkist claim, after that of George Clarence's son, the new Duke of Warwick. Henry also merged the two rival symbols of the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York to make a new emblem, the red and white Tudor Rose. Henry also shored up this position by executing other claimants, such as Warwick. Many historians consider the ascension of Henry VII to mark the end of the Wars of the Roses. However, there were a few small plots to overthrow Henry VII and restore a Yorkist claim. For example, there was the return of the pretender Perkin Warbeck, who claimed he was the Duke of York and the younger of the princes in the Tower. Despite these small revolts, Henry managed to maintain law and order and build the Tudor dynasty. The aftermath. Historians debate the extent of the impact the war has had on medieval English life. The classical view is that the many casualties among the nobility continued the changes in feudal English society caused by the effects of the Black Death. These included a weakening of the feudal power of the nobles, an increase in power of the merchant classes, and the growth of a centralized monarch under the Tudors. The end of the wars also heralded the end of the medieval period in England and a movement towards the Renaissance. However, revisionists such as Oxford historian K.B. Macfarlane suggest the effects of the conflict have been greatly exaggerated. Many places were unaffected by the wars, particularly in the eastern part of England, such as East Anglia. It has been suggested that the traumatic impact of the wars were greatly exaggerated by Henry VII to magnify his achievement in quelling them and bringing the country to peace. In populated areas, both factions had much to lose by ruining the country and sought to quickly resolve the conflict with pitched battles. Many areas did little or nothing to change their city defences. Perhaps this is an indication that they were left untouched by the wars. Philippe de Comines observed in 1470, "The realm of England enjoys one favour above all realms, that neither countryside nor people are destroyed, nor buildings burn or demolished. Misfortune falls on soldiers and nobles in particular." Thank you for watching this video. If you found it useful, please like and subscribe, and if you have any questions, please comment down below, and feel free to check out the shorter version for a quick recap.